Peter, ready? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the special webinar, Unpacking China's Belt and Road Initiative. This special event is made possible by close collaboration between Washington State China Relations Council and United States Heartland China Association. My name is Min Fan. I'm the Executive Director of U.S. Heartland China Association. But first, I'd like to turn to Noor Kokiar, Executive Director of Washington State China Relations Council, to share with you a little bit more information about the organization he leads and their mission. Noor?
Sure, thanks, Min, and good morning, everyone. Since this is our first event with the United States Heartland China Association, I'd like to briefly introduce the Washington State China Relations Council. Our organization was founded 41 years ago to help develop and improve relations between Washington State and China. We are a membership organization with members from business, government, educational, and cultural institutions, as well as individuals with an interest in China. Among our activities, we produce educational programs like today's webinar, foster connections on both sides of the Pacific, and provide advice for both business and government entities in their interactions with China. We also work actively with our local Chinese community on issues of common interest. In closing, I'd just like to briefly mention that Dr. Cohen is a frequent speaker at our events. He's a well-recognized expert on trade, and I'm sure he will provide us a lot of good information today. So thank you, Min, and back to you.
Thank you, Noor. And unlike the WSCRC, U.S. Heartland China Association is very new. We were rebranded, broadened our mission only in 2018. We do focus on strong, stable U.S.-China ties, but we focus on the Heartland region between the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. So we're honored to be working with you, Noor. Thank you. Next, two quick housekeeping items. Q&A, we did get a lot of questions already, but if you have more questions, please submit it through the Q&A. Our speaker will address them as much as he can. He is able to go beyond a little bit more the 60 minutes we have. Finally, please do take a brief moment to take the survey at the very end. We welcome your feedback. So now allow me to introduce our speaker today, Spencer Cohen, Senior Economist at Community Attributes, Inc. For more than 7 years, Spencer has served as Senior Economist for Community Attributes, Inc., a Seattle-based consulting firm, where he supervises and leads projects on international trade policy, economic impact analysis, and regional economic forecasting. Spencer is a frequent speaker on the U.S.-China trade war, China's growth model, the Pacific Northwest economy, and economic impacts of COVID-19. Spencer has a BA in mathematics and history from the University of Connecticut, an MA in China study from the University of Washington, a PhD in economic geography, also from the University of Washington, where his research focused on China's economic growth model through the lens of local government finance and land issues. Spencer has advanced fluency in Mandarin Chinese, having lived and studied in China and conducted doctoral research there. Well, we're honored to have you, Spencer. Now the floor is yours, and I'm going to stop sharing, and please bring up your slides.
All right. Let's see. Well, thank you, Min, and thank you, Noor and Man, for the opportunity to share my thoughts with all of you and with your constituents. This is a topic that I've always been very interested in, and it's become increasingly important over the years, especially as we think about U.S.-China relations and the direction they're going in, and how the Belt and Road Initiative is getting to be increasingly in the spotlight of that relationship. We just saw in August, for instance, that one of the largest players in the Belt and Road Initiative, a state enterprise called the China Communications Construction Company, was added to the U.S. Commerce Department entity list, effectively precluding U.S. companies from doing business with it. So, as much as we talk about Belt and Road as a development project, it is inseparable from broader political issues and political dynamics, especially as they play into the U.S.-China relationship. So just a quick summary of what I'd like to emphasize today during our talk. Firstly, Belt and Road Initiative, or what had previously been coined or termed the One Belt, One Road. And that's actually what it's referred to in Chinese, but the English vernacular now is Belt and Road Initiative. It's part of in part a reflection of China's own domestic infrastructure and development model. So, a lot of the grievances or I think accusations or concerns about BRI really are reflections in part of how China domestically handles infrastructure investment, entailing state banks, entailing the prominent role of large state enterprises, particularly in the infrastructure space, construction space, they're predominantly state enterprises. So, and also a lot of disconnect, and also the packaging or sort of the way that the projects are branded is quite similar between, for instance, the stimulus program in China in 2008, 2009, and the proliferation of lending to support that in various infrastructure projects in Belt and Road. BRI is also ideological as well as organizational infrastructure that transcends near all levels of government. So once it was essentially codified and elevated to the Chinese Constitution at the same time, 19th Party Congress that President Xi's own Xi Jinping thought was also enshrined in the Constitution, it really permeated all forms of government. So every provincial government has an office for BRI. Local governments also have, in their annual yearbooks, have discussions around their achievements around BRI and so forth. So it has a very extensive web of sort of organizational organs and so forth within the Chinese bureaucracy. It's also a branding exercise. So many projects, the state-owned enterprise managers will couch their projects in terms of BRI, whether or not it actually truly aligns with the principles, which are a little bit diffuse as well for BRI, but it is a branding exercise. And as such, it is somewhat incoherent, but China is definitely learning, and I think a lot of the called white elephants and challenges that China's run into with respect to development they're beginning to learn from those experiences, because it is, as much as we criticize China's actions in Sri Lanka, for instance, with the port of Hambantota, it's actually quite a black eye on China, and China is very concerned about its international reputation. And we'll talk a bit about that as well. There's also a reflection of China's genuine desire to be a global leader and a global superpower and a global power. And aid development aid is oftentimes associated with and stemming from that stature as a global power. And as I just mentioned, the BRI is increasingly inseparable from further eroding of U.S.-China relations, as made evident last month with the, as I mentioned, inclusion of the China Communications Construction Corporation on the U.S. entity list. So the rest of the talk today, I'd like to first go through kind of just a reset on why is this important? So what is the need? When we think about BRI as a geopolitical project, a geostrategic project, but there is actually quite a lot of demand for a need right now. There's a lot of need for development across the world. And, many would argue that a lot of the investments being made by the World Bank, by other countries, especially for instance Japan, which has been a major contributor to aid, as has Germany and the US, is still, while large, it's still insufficient to the infrastructure needs in the most impoverished parts of the world. So there's definitely a welcoming of more investments by other players such as China. I'll talk about what the BRI is, where those projects, and understanding China's motives, and then we'll go through as well a couple examples that have grabbed some headlines in recent years. And then time to have some discussion. So firstly, just looking at development needs. So what we're looking at this graph is per capita general government capital stock. So this is essentially a proxy for infrastructure on a per capita basis across the world. And you can see the huge divergence between advanced economies, including the US, Japan, members of the OECD, and the low income developing economies. Of course, the big outlier that's made evident in this graph is China. So China went from being of the same level as the lowest level economically least developed countries in the world in the 60s and 70s to really, and really this is a large narrative or part of the China miracle, is the rapid development infrastructure, to the point where in 2020 dollars, so it's inflation adjusted, about $26,000 per capita in terms of infrastructure capital. Still only about 70%, 69% equivalent to the advanced economies, but on a very rapid upward swing. But that being the case, China is also trying to then repivot itself to be no longer a recipient of aid, but a provider of aid to other parts of the world. And you've seen China's rapid growth, 7% growth per year in infrastructure investments. Now, a lot of that true may be inefficient. We've seen a lot of examples of China has its own bridges to nowhere, but for the most part, that infrastructure has led to sizable return on investments in the form of increased productivity, movement of goods throughout the economy, and so forth. Just highlighting again, really looking at where that capital investment has gone. You can see, for instance, the highest, public capital stock per capita. You're seeing, of course, in places like China, or even more so in the US and the most developed parts of the world. But there's the red areas are really areas that China has heavily focused its BRI investments in for obvious reasons. So sub-Saharan Africa, a big band of it, you can see in the red, has some of the lowest infrastructure spending and capital stock in the world. You can see as well in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, as well as importantly, Central Asia and Pakistan has a very low capital stock per capita. So the Belt and Road, is really as part of that need, the Asia Development Bank a couple years ago estimated between 2016 and 2030, just the Asia Pacific region, so this is not Africa, this is not Latin America or elsewhere or Eastern Europe, just the Asia Pacific region is going to need an estimated $26 trillion of infrastructure investments to maintain, I believe, about a 3.5% growth rate for the economy overall. So China has pledged $1 trillion, and we can talk about what that trillion actually means, but it's still a drop in the bucket compared to what, according to ADB, is actually going to be needed over the next, at this point, 10 years. So when I've done this talk before, I like to have a little quiz. Unfortunately, doing it over a webinar is a little bit more challenging, so I won't do that. But I will point out, as some of you who are familiar with your global leader trivia or are pretty strong in it, a couple of notable individuals. So to the far left is Alexander Lukashenko from Belarus, who's been in the news recently for his efforts, I guess, successful to subvert an election. You've got, I'm gonna have to read the names because I'm very bad at Mirziyoyev of Uzbekistan. You also have the former leader of Kazakhstan. And then, of course, we have the most recognizable, besides President Xi, which would be President Putin, and then Al-Sisi all the way to the right from Egypt. The main point, I'm being a little bit not facetious, but just flip here. But the main emphasis here is simply that this is the BRI forum from April 2019, and that China does not apply the same moral requirements or say political requirements onto participating countries. Now that said, many democracies are participating in BRI, and maybe thriving democracies, including Europe, are part of BRI and have signed on. About 130 countries now have signed some form of MOU with China. But China does not at all require, I think you can assume obvious reasons, does not require principles such as democracy or other rights or Western values that we value in the United States, for instance, as contingent or making projects contingent upon those participation of BRI. You can see the members from the BRI coming from parts of Africa, again, Portugal, Italy, some other countries in Europe. Serbia has been actually a major participant in the BRI. And then, of course, a large amount of Asia, South Asia. India was not a participant. Even before the most recent flare-up with China, India has been very, very suspicious of the BRI. It viewed China's efforts in the Indian Ocean as effectively a modern version of a string of pearls or a containment strategy against India. So India has been very, very suspicious, as well as the fact that China's been investing very heavily in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which India views as threatening to its national security, or at least is very suspicious of. And this, of course, was before the most recent border flare-ups in the Himalaya. So in terms of the timeline, we see BRI was officially kicked off or initiated in 2013. President Xi announced the One Belt One Road in Kazakhstan, and then the maritime road, or they call the belt, the overland is the belt, and then the road is actually in the sea, but in Indonesia in October of 2013. In the third plenum of the 18-party Congress, called for facilitating the BRI, and then President Xi pledged $40 billion for creation of the Silk Road Fund from their forex reserves. The two main players, many state banks are involved, but the two main development banks that are primarily involved in the financing of BRI are the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. China Development Bank kicked in, announced it would invest $890 billion in 900 projects. And then, of course, there was the launch of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a multilateral institution, but it's headquartered in Beijing, and Beijing has the largest number of votes, or a majority number of votes in that institution. AIB, the US decided not to participate in 2015, AIB, out of suspicions and uncertainty about the role of it. Many people argue that was a mistake, and we might eventually reconsider that. But AIB has been an important player as well in BRI. So in 2017, the Forum for International Cooperation was held in Beijing. National Development Reform Commission announced an additional number of investments over 5 years, and then additional pledging by Xi to the fund, the Silk Road Fund. Importantly, at the 19th Party Congress, and as I mentioned before, the BRI was actually enshrined in the Constitution, along with Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. So this was really unusual to have, in both instances, both to have ideology named after, or an enshrinement named after an individual in the Constitution, as well as inclusion of this new policy framework for outward investment. So it really helped elevate the importance of BRI. And then, of course, a second BRI forum was held in 2019, as we just talked about. So what is it? A lot of people still debate what exactly is the BRI. There's a bunch of different sort of subcomponents to it and things that have been appended to it, as seen as belonging to the BRIs or in the spirit of the BRI. So there's the Silk Road Economic Belt, the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. But there's also the Digital Silk Road. There's various investments in other kinds of infrastructure, so foreign drones. It's also been an important way to export or help facilitate the export of Huawei and other DT and other telecom technology. I mentioned it was enshrined in the Constitution, and then officially enshrined, I should say, in March of 2018. In terms of the organization, the leadership of the BRI is within what's called the Central Small Leadership Group for BRI Development, which is headed by, I'll move up, it's better, yeah. Sorry if my voice is a little choppy. It was managed, the National Development Reform Commission, so it manages the day-to-day operations of BRI. And the Belt and Road Initiative Promotion Center is part of that, as well as offices mentioned at different locales. Give me one moment, I'm sorry. Okay. The three animating principles of the BRI, and this is in the inaugurated language, are discussion, joint construction, and sharing of benefits. So really putting a strong emphasis on the mutual benefit and cooperation with partner countries. So it's always fun to compare perspectives on what the BRI is. In this case, I'm going to compare two statements, and these to me are the extremes. So at the 2019 forum, according to General Secretary Xi Jinping, the BRI is about in collectively building One Belt One Road. The objective is to focus on interconnectedness and deepening pragmatic collaboration jointly addressing each and every danger and challenge faced by humanity side by side, and to implement mutually beneficial win-win mutual development. As the facts show, collectively building one belt, one road not only provides a new economic development opportunity for each of the world's nations, but also opens China's economic development up to a new world. However, the Trump administration has a slightly different view of this topic. According to one individual, probably both John Bolton at the time, China's Belt and Road Initiative purports to address the legitimate infrastructure demands of the world's less developed economy, but primarily aims to export China's own economic imbalances, industrial overcapacity, and political influence and strategic military success. All right. I'm sorry, looks like we're still having an audio issue. Try this one more time. Give me one moment, please. See if I can hear myself better. Okay. It's not gonna work. All right, so geographic scope. So the BRI, this is a rough presentation or visualization of the different routes and directions of BRI investment. So as I mentioned before, you can see the Silk Road is very focused, beginning in Fujian province, and then extending around Southeast Asia, and then through the Suez Canal into Europe, as well as the Polar Silk Road. There's also various initiatives, such as I mentioned, overland, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The different economic corridors include the China-Mongolia-Russia Corridor, the New Eurasian Land Bridge, China-Central Asia, West Asia, China-Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, even though, again, India is not part of BRI at this point, and the China-Indochina Peninsula. And of course, there were also the economic passages overseas. As I mentioned, the single biggest state enterprise involved in Belt and Road Initiative is the China Communications and Construction Company. By the end of 2018, this company, or this major state enterprise, had under its belt 857 BRI projects and agreements worth 63 billion US dollars. It signed $10 billion in new deals in 2018 as part of the China-Africa conference in Beijing. And you can see to the right, one of the most well-known projects by this company was the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, which was completed in 2018. Some highlights: they've built over 13,000 kilometers of roadways, 180 bridges, 3,500 kilometers of rail, 132 deep water piers. They built airports as well as container cranes, all within the BRI framework. And they are number 91 on the Global Fortune 500 as of 2018. They are the third largest construction contractor in the world and the largest in Asia. And again, as I mentioned before, 5 subsidiaries have been included as of 2020, August 2020, on the US entity list. The main reasons that were cited had to do with their involvement in construction projects in the South China Sea, but they're also seen they're also seen as a leading edge or a knife edge of BRI, according to some US government officials. Projects, for the most part, we see infrastructure and energy is about 40% as of 2017. A lot of other manufacturing, there are manufacturing projects as well that are funded through BRI across the globe. Also mining projects, information services, which would include your telecom, and then support for energy systems and finance. You can see some of the biggest recipients of projects. China, Mongolia, Russia was among the largest. Eurasian Land Bridge with 14 projects. China, Pakistan Economic Corridor received 17 projects as of 2019. There's a very large focus on infrastructure, including grid and power generation. This is a map that was produced by the Mercator Institute of China Studies in Berlin. And you can see the large extent of the proliferation of various kinds of energy projects. One of the criticisms of BRI has been that it's, as much as China has talked about advancing its goals or pursuing goals of a green economy, and it has moved in many respects with respect to investments in solar, its projects with BRI are very heavily focused on fossil fuels, and carbon-based energy. So it's been one of the major critics. There have been examples of wind as well as nuclear, you could argue, but there is a very large emphasis on coal and coal extraction, and that's been a major criticism. Last week, President Xi, during his speech to the United Nations 75th anniversary celebration commencement, made a pretty bold pledge that China is going to be expediting its goals towards original agreements in the Paris Accord. China is going to become, China originally pledged to reach peak carbon emissions by 2030. He has committed to expediting that without giving a specific date or year, and also to fast forward China's net zero emissions target from to believe now 2060. So it would be interesting to see how much that those pledges materialize, not just in China, but also through its BRI projects across the globe. So one of the concerns with China and Chinese aid is that whereas other countries, such as the US, provide what's called as official development aid, which has at least for any given aid program, it's 25% grant. It often has much more than that, but at a minimum, a project is 25% grant. So there's no repayment requirements for that part of the aid. The vast majority of Chinese projects historically, from 2000 to 2014, are not of that structure. So they're predominantly lending and lending only. So even though China approaches the US with respect to has approached the US with respect to total amount of aid provided, the vast majority of that is not what we consider to be official development aid. And you've seen the same story. This is 2005 to 2014. So this for the most part predates BRI. And it's a similar story where a very large percentage of investment has been in energy generation and transport and storage, so infrastructure and energy extraction and transmission lines. And the projects, as you can see, 23% energy supply and generation, transport and storage about 18%. And then the share of that's official development assistance is quite low. So those projects that are funded with a large share of it being of a grant component, only 6% of those big energy projects fall into that category. So why is China pursuing the BRI? Why is it important and what are its objectives? So this is an incomplete list, but it's just an initial sort of rendering of what are the major motivations and scales on why it's pursuing this monumental investment project or program. It is not the Marshall Plan. China itself has said that it's not a Marshall Plan, but why is it pursuing such a large initiative? Well, there are possible motivations. Firstly, there are the domestic motivations. So China does in fact have issues around overcapacity for state enterprises. Was a huge increase. Capital has been historically very cheap for the state enterprise sector and for the capital goods sector in China at the expense of households. So the financial system has long been structured to encourage investment over consumption as a share of GDP. So we're seeing a lot of excess capacity now, potentially in the Chinese economy, and so looking for ways to export that overcapacity. There's also geographic economic disparities. Even before the flare-ups and issues in Western China and Xinjiang, for instance, for a long time, Western China has always been much more impoverished. And there's always been concerns that as it lags behind, it's more susceptible to unrest. And so looking for ways to integrate further, being with the development of the West program as far back as 2000. But using BRI to encourage more economic activity passing through and engaging with or involving West China has always been an interest as well. Exporting savings. China has obviously a large amount of savings, so looking for ways to export that savings in other ways other than buying US treasuries. There's also, of course, national pride and rejuvenation, which cannot really be overstated. So, you know, China does see it as becoming a great power, and as part of great powers, it does involve being much more active in the development world. China has long seen itself going as far back as the 1960s with the non-alignment movements during the Cold War as a leader of or aspiring to be a leader of the developing world. And of course, to help companies find new overseas markets. You look at a lot of the telecom investments that are being made in Pakistan, for instance, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, other parts of Central Asia, with Huawei and ZTE technology components, which has been really important, especially given the ban and the friction over that technology in the US and many of our allies. There's also the geopolitical dynamics, what we call the Malacca Strait dilemma. So the fact that the US Navy has a predominant position in the Asia Pacific. And so if there ever was, and hopefully there never will be, but if there ever was some conflagration with China, between the China and the US, given the existing energy supply lines, US would be able to cut off, probably would most likely be able to cut off key energy supply lines to China primarily through the Strait of Malacca as a choke point, as well as other choke points. So looking for ways to hedge against those risks. And as part of that, really in general, even beyond that, looking for ways to increase energy supply routes and arterials. So China is going to increasingly demand more energy. And so looking for alternative sources, and a lot of it will be overland, or at least partially. So the port of Gwadar in Pakistan is intended to, in large part, serve the need through an overland pipeline feeding into a port, which then bring in Persian Gulf fuel. There's the soft power, the Joseph Nye sort of soft power and spheres of influence. So China can use BRI as an enticement to encourage countries, for instance, to align with it on certain key issues, such as recognition or disowning its recognition of Taiwan. Those countries disowning of the recognition of Taiwan, as an example, as well as other geopolitical issues that China wishes to find supporting countries. As I mentioned, the branding components. And there's the building alliances and supporting existing allies. So a big part of the CPEC, or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is also about just helping to support what's been a very tumultuous ally domestically, Pakistan. So Pakistan's long been a key ally of China, but there's been a lot of unrest. And we'll talk a bit about that as well. And then lastly, other motivations. There's been talk about a gradual internationalization of the renminbi. I'm not terribly sold on that argument, but that is one that is being offered as another explanation, because increasingly the transactions are price being transacted in renminbi. I don't think that doesn't, to me, imply that there's going to be a move towards a reserve currency role for the renminbi, but that is one topic of discussion. As I mentioned, new growth opportunities, and then of course, aid is a common feature of great power status. So just covering a few data points. One, firstly, of course, I mentioned is overcapacity. The largest, you can see that debt to GDP ratio is now about 300%. A big part of that are the non-financial corporations, of which a huge chunk of that are what we call local government investment vehicles, which are local government enterprises that are able to borrow on behalf of local government. There was a large proliferation of these enterprises during the global financial crisis in order to help facilitate investments in infrastructure, and they've been a major driver of that increase in debt over time. So I mentioned the uneven developments. Again, vast majorities of the West fall into the category of least developed parts of China. So trying to find ways on, this is on a GDP per capita basis, which has its own flaws in terms of data reporting by the Chinese government. But still, the general theme is true in that there's a large disparity geographically in China, much more so than we're familiar with in the US in terms of development. And then the Chinese net energy consumption measured in kilowatts has been on a fairly linear path, and it doesn't seem to be declining much. Now, the composition of that energy might change, or it has been changing, but there is still an enormous amount of energy demand for China, and they're going to have to be looking for other sources for the energy over time. So what are the concerns that we've heard about the BRI projects? So one of the concerns, and I have added opinions about some of these, but what the strength of argument of some of these, but firstly is that state enterprises have access to very cheap capital, so they can outbid other firms, but then need to revise those project budgets. So there's a lack of transparency, a bit of opacity in terms of the project bidding process. And the fact that in most cases it's Chinese state enterprises that are the ones that are bidding for those projects and are required as part of contingent on the link by China for these projects that it's primed by a Chinese contractor. I think that there's a bit of an oversimplification of that argument only because in China, the vast majority of infrastructure projects or construction companies are state enterprises, and they also happen to be some of the largest state enterprise, or sorry, largest construction companies in the world as well. So there is a dynamic there, but there are also concerns that the projects don't employ enough local labor, they don't benefit enough the local communities and local economies, and they also have not a great record with respect to the UN sustainability goals, development goals. There is perceived debt trap diplomacy. There are some out there who accuse China of using unfavorable lending terms or unrealistic lending terms to kind of essentially snooker countries into loans that they can't pay back and therefore have to relinquish sovereign assets. Again, I think that's way overstated. I think in the case of Port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, China it was more an outcome of clumsy inexperience as well as corruption in Sri Lanka that led to that outcome. I don't believe China has some broad sweeping nefarious strategy for seizing sovereign assets, but we'll talk about that as well. There is mismanagement and poor administration of many projects. Again, it's a learning process. There are concerns about BRI being part of a broader military project. So Djibouti now is home to China's first overseas base, military base. There's of course the bridges to nowhere, and that's been a big problem with respect to a lot of BRI projects, is the fact that if you look at a lot of different, like Malaysia, for instance, other countries that have been recipients of BRI, those projects have not, the economic viability or feasibility of those projects has been called into question. And once you have a leadership change, like you had in Malaysia, they were quickly scrutinized and canceled in many cases because there was also an element of corruption in the recipient country as part of those projects. Questions about the secrecy of the deals, as I mentioned about the branding aspects. And then really importantly, I want to really emphasize is that China's taken the tack that infrastructure is a key driver of economic development. But so I would argue actually, or I do argue that institutions are actually more important than infrastructure. And so China's put a lot of emphasis on infrastructure and physical capital as a way to help other partner countries grow and move out of poverty. But ultimately, it's really about institutions that are the main drivers. So a couple, as I know, problems. Malaysia had canceled $22 billion of Chinese-backed deals after they had a leadership change. And there were some investigations into the previous president's, prime minister, involvement in those projects and using BRI projects to cover up essentially siphoning off of government funds. So there was a corruption element to it. There's also been BRI projects in Europe as well. So Costco, which is a major shipping conglomerate, acquired a majority stake in the port of Piraeus in Greece in 2016. So China's actually been much more involved in port projects across the globe, including working with Dubai ports as well. So investing in major port infrastructure. So I'll talk a little bit about the Port of Hambantota now. Because I do think it has gotten a lot of attention, and there've been a lot of, I think, misunderstandings and things we still don't know about this project, but I kind of want to at least try to unpack a little bit about what happened, what transpired, and what's the current situation in Hambantota. So you can see on this map that Port of Hambantota is the southern coast of Sri Lanka. It's to the east of Colombo, which is the largest port as well for Sri Lanka. The maritime port was built in 2010 for about $1.4 billion, 85% of which was funded by the Exim Bank. Now, the important thing, and again, this is a common feature of BRI projects, is a lot of them were essentially grandfathered in, so that there were projects already underway that were rebranded as BRI after 2013. And this was essentially the case with Sri Lanka. This port was built before the BRI, but then it was repackaged as a BRI project. It is viewed as a strategic location in the Indian Ocean. It is also, I should mention, so it's funded by Exim Bank. However, in 2015, the Sri Lankan government had difficulties paying for this project, and as well as other projects, to its lenders in Beijing. And then China Harbor, which is a subsidiary of the China Communication Construction Corporation, was accused of interfering in the 2015 election in Sri Lanka. So, faced with a cash shortage, the government in 2017 opted to lease the port. So it didn't give the sovereignty away, but at least 15,000 acres of associated land to China Merchants Ports Holdings, including allowing for 70% of the profits for 99 years. Oops. So, firstly, you know, the economic rationale for the Port of Hambantota did not really add up, and for a number of reasons. Firstly, there was already a large, active, utilized, but not at close to capacity port at Colombo. So there's no economic rationale for investing in a new port, at least to my knowledge. There was rationale politically because the president at the time, that's his home district. That was his home district. So there was a bit of perceived economic, political, you know, sort of favoritism happening perhaps, but there was not a strong economic rationale for that port. It was maybe a new node in the shipping lane in the Indian Ocean, but has not received many port of calls. So for instance, just in 2012, it struggled to attract any ships. 34 ships in 2012 made port of calls at Hambantota versus 3,700 at the Port of Colombo. So that's why it's often deemed to be China's white elephant. And I think China ultimately kind of fell into this one. I don't think that there was a scheming plan. I don't believe it was a way to, you know, build a bridgehead to potentially, you know, projecting influence and power, India's, you know, sort of India's sphere of influence. I think it kind of they just kind of fell into this one, in my view. I don't think there was a grand strategy, seize territory, as what's been oftentimes framed. You can see that, you know, Sri Lanka, its external debt has risen substantially since 2009. Part of that, of course, was from the global financial crisis. But you see even afterwards, it has still continued to rise at a fairly fast clip in terms of its external debt or debt it's owned to outside countries and lenders. So it's questionable said that it was a questionable project from an economic standpoint, more so I think than in an instance of predatory lending. The other case study I'd like to talk about briefly is the China-Pakistan economic corridor. This one has pretty significant economic strategic importance. As I mentioned, it will provide port access or help to integrate infrastructure and trading routes and energy supply routes between Western China and the Gulf and Arabian Sea. It's estimated to cost about $62 billion over the span of a series of projects in this corridor. However, just like many other BRI projects, it's come under scrutiny with a leadership change. So just like in Malaysia and just like in Sri Lanka and many other places, when the new Pakistan Prime Minister came into power, there was immediate scrutiny of these projects, and scrutiny because of the economic viability of these projects. and which really helped to sully, I think, some of the strong, very strong relationship between China and Pakistan historically because of that. They're still moving forward, and Pakistan is still in BRI, but there's been a scaling back of many projects because of the questions about viability. There's also been a lot of pushback domestically. So in Baluchistan, which is one of the major areas where the project runs through, you can see in this area near the coast near Karachi, the part of Gwadar, there's been historically a lot of unrest and some unrest around access to gas reserves and economic equity and so forth, and civil unrest. And so to the point where the Pakistani government has actually allocated I think about 10,000 troops to protect some of these Chinese investments. So there's definitely a lot of uncertainty and insecurity around these projects. It does involve highway. It's a kind of a suite of offerings, or it's a full package. Highway, port, rail, pipeline, energy, and various other infrastructure. It'll run through 2030, but again, it's being reassessed. It's the largest project or package of projects Pakistan has ever undergone since independence. So as of, roughly about $26 billion worth of projects have been completed. 75% of those are energy projects, 60% are coal. So again, it kind of bucks the perception that China is trying to do something, or it calls out China, wanting to be a greener economy, and yet continue to invest in coal-based and carbon-based energy sources. The interest terms are at about 2%. The World Bank interest rates typically for lending on these projects is about 1.7%, so it's quite close. The important thing, going back to the need for aid, is that, even though, so China it's mostly lending, it does not have a concessionary component to it. The interest rates are close, but it is offering aid and investment, not just here, but in Africa and elsewhere, for projects that would not otherwise likely have happened. So there is they're increasing the amount of funds available, even though they're primarily lending and there's no concessionary component to it. The Port of Gwadar is the main feature. It's kind of the main sort of component of the CPEC. It's run by China Overseas Port Holding Company, which of course is a state enterprise. There's new multi-purpose berths, 9 of them, and along 3.0 kilometers of seafront. It's really essentially a brand new port that's being constructed. And again, this will help to alleviate some of the concerns about a choke point in the Straits of Malacca in the future, which hopefully never happens, but that is a concern. So just last more comments before we go to Q&A. And so, as I mentioned, Pakistan has had problems balancing its finances. Its reduction in Pakistan BRI investments, they've been reducing it with a new focus on mining and gas. There's also been more of an emphasis on things, more traditional development projects, looking at socioeconomic initiatives like health and education. They're trying to negotiate those. Again, coming to a realization that infrastructure, it's not as if you build it and they will come in the case of infrastructure. You have to invest in institutions, you have to invest in human development, in health and education. You can't just invest in bridges and energy supply lines and so forth, although those are important. Lots of projects have been put on hold. There's been a pretty extensive, across many countries now, renegotiating of BRI projects because of the pandemic. So the pandemic has certainly delayed the ability of those countries to begin repayment on those projects, as well as concerns about how long the session will last for many of those countries, and the impact on the viability of these projects. So just a few final comments, because we're hitting 45 minutes. So firstly, despite all of the tension between the US and China, the BRI does not necessarily have to be an extension of that growing tension between our two countries. It unfortunately is, because of, even though the BRI is, I think, still quite diffuse and still actually quite incoherent in terms of its objectives and its goals, there's a lot we can graft onto it in context of a rivalry with the US, between US and China. So we can invest a lot of our concerns about China writ large in its actions interpret them through the prism of our relationship, our current, somewhat, quite fraught relationship, intense relationship right now. China does not have an exportable growth model per se, but its practices in some areas mirror domestic infrastructure investment. So we can learn a lot about BRI by looking at how China does its own domestic infrastructure investments, and vice versa. We can look at how China handles the BRI projects to get a little bit of external insight into China's own practices domestically with respect to infrastructure. As I mentioned, yes, it's true, prices have been heavily involved, but they're also, they dominate the construction sector both in China and Asia Pacific, so it's not that shocking. And in many cases, US aid is often contingent upon US companies being heavily involved in those projects. But it's really about the benefit to those communities that should be, I think the focus of the critique should be much more focused on the benefit to those communities. How many workers locally are being hired to support those projects? How many construction workers are being hired locally? How much supply is being purchased locally, irrespective of who the prime contractor is? And then, while the BRI is part of President Xi's legacy, so it's not going away. It's been enshrined in the Constitution. It is here to stay. It will evolve, and China is going to learn from its past mistakes. The port of Hambantota, as I mentioned, is sort of a black eye on its reputation, and it does not want to be perceived as a predatory, colonial, sort of imperialist, even though there are some that fear that it is using BRI for that purpose. It certainly does not want to be perceived that way. So there is a genuine interest in being perceived, I believe, as a global leader, and seeing aid as a an important sort of component or element or aspect of global leadership. And then politics, of course, and development are not mutually exclusive. The erosion, as I mentioned, with US-China relations, and then folding in BRI indirectly through the placing of its most important state enterprise on the entity list. And just to leave with one last point is that, again, economic development is not just about investment. If China is really serious about making investments in to support economic development, it's going to have to require more than building bridges and roadways. It has to be about investing in human developments, in institutions, and various other elements, of socioeconomic investments, education, so forth, to help drive growth in those countries. So with that, I wish everybody a happy Mid-Autumn Festival, as well as for our Chinese listeners also a happy National Day, and happy to take any questions right now.
Great. So Spencer, before we jump in, I want to mention among the pre-submitted questions, there are a lot of questions regarding the perspective from Africa. I know the US-China-Africa relationship has been going through some changes. Have you, through your research, uncovered any perspective from the African countries on this?
Well, I haven't looked very closely yet at Africa, but there have been some pretty sizable projects that were done in Africa. As I mentioned before, the Mombasa, single gauge railway between Kenya and Nairobi, from Nairobi to, I believe, I forget how far it goes, but has been a huge project. And I think, was definitely, if you look at the earlier on, we looked at the level of development and level of available physical, as much as I say that institutions matter, as much as I say that human development matters as a key tenet of development, Africa is still, in many parts of Africa, still woefully behind in terms of per capita physical capital, i.e., infrastructure assets and in good condition. So there's still a necessity, and Africa has benefited enormously from those investments, I believe. Now, there's been a lot of tension. There have been instances where there are perceived, with respect to mining and resource extraction, the news, there's definitely been a lot of coverage of tensions that have gone on with respect to the sort of the extraction and very little benefit accruing to those communities when China goes in with its mining companies and extracts a large amount of, minerals from Africa for re-export back to China for processing. But, I think there's also really good stories. I think that these countries are welcoming China for a reason, and that they really need that investment. They need the infrastructure. Those mining operations provide jobs, and help with employment. So I think there's probably, and again, I haven't looked too carefully at Africa, but I just know what I know about in the data I've looked at about the definite need for infrastructure investments in Africa. I think that there are good stories that probably get lost in the mix because of the negativity around a few cases of tension, for instance, or issues and challenges around Chinese mining investments, for instance.
Great, thank you. Looks like we got 10 questions queued up.
I better look at the questions.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'll let you moderate.
Okay. One of the first questions about, from Bill Cohen, what is the rationale behind offering aid and not having a portion of that be considered grants?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a question that a lot of people are wondering about with China. It's like, if you're really serious about being a developing, if China's really serious about being a real contributor to development around the world and wants to be a leader in development, you can't just lend money. You have to actually make real foreign aid contributions in the form of grants, right? Or at least part of their projects. And that's been one of the sticking points. I think part of it is, I think there's a two-part answer. I think, and there's many more parts, but I'll give two parts. I think one is that China's still learning. I think it's doing things at a very tepid pace. That's the way China does things historically. Domestically, with respect to development, China is very much experimentation oriented. So they try something out in a very defined locality. They see if it works, and if it works, they scale it. And that's been the narrative beginning all the way back to the beginning of the reform period. I think that applies to BRI. I think that they've got this meta framework they're working with, but they're also choosing specific, they're trying things out, and they're saying, well, if we just lend the money, it's lower risk on our part. And we won't be seen as well. I think that the concern is that China's still a developing economy. I mean, granted, there are parts of China, like the major, cities like Shanghai and Beijing, for instance, and Shenzhen, that are extremely affluent, very affluent cities. Although even there are pockets of poverty. But overall, China's still a developing economy. It's still at most a middle income country trying to avoid a middle income trap and continue to grow. And so I think there's a lot of demand for services and investments domestically. So if China were to start giving money out in the form of grants, I think it would cause potentially some political backlash that they would like to avoid. Whereas if it's lending, it's a little bit so-called less risky politically as well. The other thing is that, and this really goes to China seeing the world through the lens of China, so to speak. A lot of China, the Chinese financial system is not like the American financial system by any stretch. Even though Chinese banks have had some of the largest IPOs on record, they have foreign investors. They seem like private banks, but they're not private banks. They're majority owned by the government, by the Ministry of Finance, for instance. So if you look at the stimulus, if you look at how China invested in infrastructure in, you look at the 2009 stimulus program, for instance, the vast majority of the so-called stimulus was actually bank lending. And the reason is because those banks are really almost in some aspects an extension of fiscal policy. They're not monetary, they're almost an extension of fiscal policy. They follow the guidance in moral suasion, so to speak, of the central government, and are directed to lend money in certain ways. And so and they lend to state enterprises, there's almost a moral hazard component as well, because there's the expectation those state enterprises are going to pay that money back is sort of, eroded somewhat, right? Or the confidence, there's a loosening or soft budget constraint, so to speak. So because of that, I think that they also they don't draw the distinction so much between grants abroad and lending. To them, lending in some respects is not that much different than fiscal action or fiscal policy or fiscal spending in the way that a grant would be part of fiscal spending. So that would be my two short answers to that, but I think there are many more. That's a really good question.
Thank you. We definitely have more questions than the time you have, but I know you have graciously agreed to stay a little longer. There's a question about the digital Silk Road. and the 5G. And do you have any kind of comments on that and the intention behind that as part of the key goal of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, definitely. So so there's been a term that's there's a, our whole relationship with China is full of buzzwords now and buzz terms, but one is the splinter net, where we're seeing this divergence and sort of divorcing of US, or fear of, or at least movement towards divorcing of US internet, or Western internet, the internet and digital economy, and the Chinese digital economy and Chinese internet. And that was started by the Chinese firewall, to be clear, but you're seeing as all part of this broader discussion around economic decoupling, which I can talk extensively about as well, but that's another whole topic. But you are beginning to see movement towards potentially two different spheres, and of 5G is the battleground right now for that so-called splinter net movement in decoupling. So China's making moves because it has Huawei, for instance, is arguably the leading 5G company in the world right now. It's prevented from, it's under attack in the US, and it's under attack among our allies. Britain's been, the UK recently also banned implementation of 5G hardware in many applications. So you're seeing a movement towards trying to block Huawei. And so they have to find other places for, Huawei, is essentially a national champion, even though China does not use that terminology like was used in the developmental states of the 80s, 70s and 80s, but it is effectively a national champion. And it is seen as kind of like China becoming a global leader in technology. And so they're looking for new spaces for Huawei to grow, as well as ZTE, as well as other companies. And so the Belt and Road does offer opportunities to expand Huawei networks into places that have not come under sufficient, let's say, US pressure to block implementation of that hardware. So I think that's a big part of it, and that'll potentially become a big element of BRI in the near future. Even is going to be, as we see this growing tension. We've seen it, just recently with the executive orders against TikTok and WeChat, and that growing splintering and divorcing of our two sort of spheres of the internet. So
great. So there's a question, as you mentioned, politics you can't put aside, and there are a lot of talking about participating countries involved in BRI have internal debates and backlashes, and so China historically has a principle of non-intervention in other state affairs. But then you also need to reclaim BRI loans. So how do you see they can balance both?
Mm-hmm.
The non-intervention, but you want your money back.
Yeah. I think I think that's why I describe BRI more as clumsy than strategic. I do think, there have been instances where China has found itself entangled, or at least there have been accusations of becoming entangled in domestic or indigenous politics because of the BRI and because of those projects. So in the case of the Port of Hambantota, there were concerns, as I mentioned, about one state enterprise being, involved in trying to sway an election in support of the incumbent president, who was a big supporter of that project. But certainly, and you've seen it too, where in Malaysia, for instance, the Malaysian prime minister was using BRI funds to essentially, or is accused of using BRI funds, the former prime minister, to cover up investments or funds that have been siphoned off. So from other funds. So, whether China means to or wants to or not, whenever you're lending money to these governments, and unfortunately, a lot of these governments have issues of corruption that are pretty widespread. Not all of them, but there is a higher level of corruption oftentimes in these countries than you would find in the US or Western Europe, for instance, or Japan. So because of that, they inevitably get entangled in those issues. How much they want to participate or see, they want to see the political dynamics play in such a way as to ensure, I think, that they certainly want to get repaid for sure. So, but how much they want to be involved in the actual making that happen, I'm not sure about. But they almost stumble into it inevitably, into some of these issues, the domestic indigenous politics as a result of that, and they become a focal point too. You know, a lot of countries, there's been public backlash at BRI projects because, again, they're not seen sometimes as benefiting the communities. They're seen as, you know, I don't believe China is to proactively behave in an imperial way, but there are accusations that China is being very colonial in its actions, in the way it invests funds or diverts funds towards certain kinds of projects. So there is a perception, and perceptions are hard to break. And there's been public backlash in some countries because they're not seeing the benefits accrue to the local population in the way they were expecting them to.
Great. Hey, Spencer, we got a question from David from Colorado. Do you believe that BRI tends to be a bilateral vehicle versus a multilateral one because of the difficulty of constructing and managing multilateral agreements, or due to the lack of interest in providing institutional value?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. China really goes out of its way to present BRI as a multilateral, essentially a multilateral framework, but in the end, it's bilateral. I mean, all the deals are negotiated. You know, it's China. China is the focal point, and all of the deals, all of the BRI forms, they sign on all these countries through MOUs to be participants in the BRI. But if BRI was a multilateral framework or institution, then the decision making about those investments would be happening in negotiation across many countries, and there would be some sort of decision making body in the same way that the World Bank is a multilateral institution. And so all the investments in the World Bank, even though they're the funding in it's almost the flip side. So the World Bank is multilateral, and as part of that, the funding is highly diffuse, right? So it's highly distributed. Lots of countries contribute to the World Bank, and the World Bank then makes a collective decision. But then there's a focal point where the World Bank as an institution makes decisions about where money should go for investment projects. China is like the BRI is like the inverse of that. So China is effectively the only benefactor of the BRI. Even though there is the Asian Investment Bank, Infrastructure Investment Bank, but China is the primary majority stakeholder in that bank. But there is some participation by AIIB in that as well. But for the most part, China is the primary driver of the source of funds, the lending. And the multilateralism is really just multilateral, or it's multi. It's just that there are many recipient partner countries, but all of the deals are done in a bilateral fashion.
So about the deals, there's a question about when they sign those MOU, do we know the rough percentage of follow through, or if there's an open bidding, or it's already, if it's signed MOU, the deal is pretty much given to the Chinese SOEs?
So I don't have the specifics, but my understanding is that in most cases, there's a specific requirement in most cases that the prime contractor for the project would be a Chinese state enterprise. So there might be some bidding. I believe there is some bidding in some instances, but for the most part, it's either explicitly or implicitly understood that the Chinese state enterprise will be the one that will conduct that investment, or that project. But that being said, again, you know, I think that the more important issue is really how the money is being spent and benefiting the local community more than who's the prime contractor. Because you can structure a contract in a way, or even if you have a Chinese state enterprise as the prime contractor, there's a strong contingent requirement that they hire locally for X amount, or you can build those conditions in, I think. So being more, I think, countries need to be more forceful on that front in trying to really shape the investments in terms of more focused on socioeconomic development, as well as a higher requirement for local hiring. But again, because it's also the constant, unfortunately, I think a lot of these, like a lot of countries that are recipients of BRI, especially those with very low infrastructure, capital stock, are not going to have enough of the sort of technical know-how and in local expertise and companies with the scale to build the kind of projects that are being proposed. So then we're talking about, if it's not, you know, a major US or German company, for instance, or a few others, it's going to be a Chinese company or a Japanese company. So it's not a large pool, it's not a large set of major global construction companies in the world that are able to do these kind of projects.
Great. I think we have time for 3 questions. We'll definitely end on the positive one. Here's a question from Nor. Yesterday, Jim McGregor noted on webinar that the conditions for Western aid are often quite cumbersome, i.e. issues about environment and labor are included in the aid contract. He noted that BRI projects have fewer restrictions, so are easier for countries to access. Do you see any maturation of BRI contracts, i.e. moving toward being more environmentally friendly, etc.?
Well, I think that, you know, if China, like, you know, again, going back to President Xi's pledge at the UN General Assembly virtually last week, if he's serious about China continuing to expedite, you know, its role or its investments and its targets for zero carbon emissions, for peak and then zero carbon emissions, that's going to have to extend to BRI projects. You know, China cannot meet those goals in the Paris Accord, and even those more aggressive goals that were stated last week. If he's serious about it, which I hope he is, I hope they are, they can't achieve those if they're going to continue to import fossil fuels from the Middle East, you know, or expand their importation of fossil fuels from the Middle East. So I think that, you know, those kinds of projects, whether it's building coal extraction or coal-fired power plants in other countries, you know, I think that they're going to have to integrate more and more a green element or greater awareness and you know, intentionality around making those projects cleaner. But again, I think that there's a learning process, and I think that on an optimistic note, I think that China is going to, you know, it's taken a few black eyes. It does not want to be seen as a pariah by any stretch. It wants to be seen in a very positive light and really wield a lot of soft power around the world. It does actually want to achieve those goals. And I think it will, maybe not to the extent we want it to, but I think it will begin to, you know, I think there already been some self-recognition on the part of the Chinese that they need to find ways to skew more of those projects towards renewable energy, for instance. On other parts that were mentioned, the cumbersome aid requirements, you know, I think a lot of that, I mean, you know, to the extent that we don't, you know, China does not require or does not, you know, is willing to lend money to projects and for countries that maybe the US might not want to lend money to. You know, investments in countries that are known to have, you know, repressive regimes is less of an obstacle for China than the US. So I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But I think, and I think a lot of those countries, again, there's so much demand for aid in the world right now, or has been, that especially for physical capital, that you know, there's only so much that the US, Japan, Western Europe, and so forth, the World Bank, the IMF can lend for. So, you know, there's still going to be an enormous amount of aid demand out there that China can fill. So
great. And so one more question. There's a lot of people been bringing up the U.S. Army's lesson, how we build a global footprint for our military base, and they train the soldiers, they work with local people. What are the lessons the Chinese could learn from U.S. military? Do you have any comment?
Well, it's hard to compare because, and I'm not a historian, but so I'm going to wing it. But like, I think that it's hard to compare military expansion today, military investments today, and military strategy with when the U.S. in the period of the Cold War really expanded our footprint. You know, in the aftermath of World War II, you know, building a deterrence force in Western Europe, in Germany, in England, you know, and all of the proxy confrontations with the Soviet Union. You know, that was an animating feature of military investments across the globe. and trying the U.S. containment strategy. But we face a different kind of competition with China. It's more economic, and it's also the kinds of military investments are different these days, right? We're talking about less about forward bases, for instance, and more about asymmetric warfare with respect to everyone's talked a lot about China's surface-giving missile weaponry arsenal, anti-aircraft carrier missile technology and so forth. So it's not, I'm not trying to, I guess those are still, the traditional conventional warfare is still important, or warfare hardware is still really important, but there are also other avenues for projecting power and sort of threat of coercion beyond simply having a forward military base. People cite Djibouti, for instance, as an example of China beginning to embrace the forward military base kind of model, I think, that the U.S. has long had. But I also don't see, and I'm more of an optimist, I don't see the U.S. and China engaging in a Cold War. I think that's a misuse of the term. And for those same reasons, there are significant flashpoints that could erupt into some kind of conflagration, such as the Taiwan Straits, to a lesser extent, South China Sea. But I do think, I think that there are other lessons. I think China is going much more a soft power approach than it is with trying to invest in overseas military bases, with the exception, of course, being the South China Sea, where there is actual territorial, there is a territorial dispute that China is then trying to project power in that arena, but not in the model of how the U.S. built military bases around the world as part of a containment strategy during the Cold War.
Great. So finally, given your optimistic spirit, and we do have a question about, what are the long-term benefits of BRI? Or do you think when the Chinese ambition, their hope for the world, realize it, what do you think it could do for education, technology, skill improvements, and human capital? What are the potential?
Well, I think the potential's there. I think any foreign aid is welcome, but not all foreign aid is equal, right? So, as I mentioned before, infrastructure is important, but historically, infrastructure is not a majority component of foreign aid by the World Bank, for instance, and by donors like the U.S. It's really about institution building. You have to build institutions, and those institutions, I should say, institutions have to come domestically. They have to be indigenous. Institutions around property rights, around other kinds of rights, rights that encourage markets to operate correctly, institutions around labor markets, capital markets, like those are things that have to happen domestically for a country to really thrive and break out of a cycle of poverty. And no number of bridges or roadways is going to fix that problem. You have to have, and it's been sort of the paradox in all the literature on economic history and political economy, is if you have a society that lacks those necessary institutions that we see thrive in other parts of the world where there is a strong economic growth, how do you break that cycle? How do you create institutions, or how do you evolve institutions in a way where they will respect those things, or they will encourage, property rights regimes, for instance? So, I think that part of it's potentially human development in terms of education. It's health. It's a lot of poverty is a function, of health. If people are not healthy, if they don't have basic clean water and sanitation, there's no way they're going to have time or be able to thrive as an economy. They're not going to be able to learn, study and learn and participate in labor markets and innovate if you are not a healthy person. So, I think if China were really serious about, trying to drive, and there's tons of literature on this, but if China was really more serious about encouraging economic growth in all these countries, and really in expanding it's really growing its soft power, it needs to invest in those kinds of projects, whether it's, health projects, building, clean water facilities, which is infrastructure, but, those projects are much more impactful, I think, in the long run than bridges and mining extraction and so forth.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Spencer, for your excellent presentation. And I also thank the audience for your active participation. And thank you, Nor and Men from Washington State Council for Relations with China. And we really appreciate your partnership. And you all have a happy holiday and good rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.